some hope that inflation will come down. But these are very high rates of inflation, and certainly rates of inflation outside the RBI's norm. So the RBI is working. It has more work to do. I hope it is successful. But at this point, to argue that inflation is not a problem would, I think, be overstating the case. And certainly because inflation is high in certain elements like food and fuel, they affect the budgets, especially of poor people, substantially. So it is a concern.
So therefore, the comparison that has been, at least by politicians, some politicians like Rahul Gandhi, for example, made that comparison with Sri Lanka, saying that India could go the Sri Lanka way. An exaggeration, you would say, or just not the right comparison to make?
I would say there's a different reason than today saying we'll go the Sri Lanka way because of our current economic situation. I think we're far from that. But I would say that on another element, which is on the issue of minorities and their place in the nation, Sri Lanka certainly had a large minority, the Tamils. And in the 80s, when they had a problem of jobless growth, politicians found it particularly easy to deflect some of the attention to the problem of minorities and made a bogeyman out of the Tamils, essentially creating the kind of strife that resulted in civil war and eventually in a huge problem for Sri Lanka. I would say the roots of Sri Lanka's current economic problems lie in that troubled history of the past. Otherwise, they were actually quite a successful middle-income country. And I think Mr. Gandhi, certainly in pointing out the parallels, is talking as much about the fact that we are sort of in danger of demonizing our minorities and creating the kind of internal strife that leads nowhere good. And I would say that, to my mind, is the lesson from Sri Lanka. Let us work for communal harmony and unity of the country. That will serve us well, not just in protecting us from the kinds of incidents that took place in Sri Lanka, but also will be strong for the economy. But I would say, it's as much for the integrity of the country as for anything else.
Well, most importantly for the integrity of the country, and I think for all of us as a society. But I just wanted to get a sense from you that when there is this kind of communal strife that makes headlines around the world, when investors look at it, what do they think? I mean, how does it in fact affect the investment climate potentially? What is the potential effect it could have for India?
Well, people worry, right? Because first, they certainly do think about the consequences down the line. Days when their factories can't function because of problems. Now, we are not there yet. Let me emphasize that we are some distance away from that, but it is something that we should start worrying about, given the kind of fuel that is being fed to this fire by some of our politicians. But I think the other thing they think about is: do I really want to do business with a country which undermines its minorities, mistreats its minorities? Certainly, when you look at China and what they've done with the Uyghurs, they have got a lot of pushback in the United States, in Europe, from their treatment of the Uyghurs. There are now sanctions against goods that are produced there, but there are also increasingly motions by shareholders saying we want you to stop doing business in these areas with these kinds of people and so on. So my sense is civil society also plays a part once these things become really prominent and it becomes problematic for a country, especially if it wants to engage. Certainly at the politician to politician level, they may overlook some of these things because of realpolitik. They really want to work with you because there's a third party you're both enemies with. But when it comes to civil society in these countries, they also play a role, and it is important to have an image of being a tolerant, respectful democracy. I think that serves us well.
Well, it's interesting that you said that it's important to have an image of being a tolerant, respectful democracy. Are we that today, Raghuram Rajan? Very honestly, you said something very interesting over the weekend, where you talked about the importance of India being a liberal democracy and how some quarters argue that India needs, an authoritarian leadership with few checks and balances, and that you fear that we're actually heading in that direction. So are we still a liberal democracy?
I would say less so than maybe 10 years ago. I would say that if we can do the right things, we can certainly restore what we've lost. But I think the further you go down this path, the harder it becomes to go back. And that is why it's very important for everyone to work towards strengthening our democratic institutions, making sure that Parliament works, making sure that our elections are vibrant, free and fair, making sure our judicial system treats everyone equally, and there is no bias towards or against specific communities. These are all things which are bread and butter of strong democracies. These have been our bread and butter, and certainly in many places they still are our bread and butter. But we should constantly be vigilant to slippage, because often as you slip, it becomes a faster and faster slide, and it is very, very hard to go back.
Part of becoming perhaps a more authoritarian democracy, which some think we are today, is the over-centralization of power. And how does that then impact economic decisions that are taken? I mean, you can see that, for instance, center-state relations are terrible at the moment. States are fighting with the center constantly about GST, for example. How is that affecting just basic reforms that the government may want to undertake, like GST?
Well, I think democracy works well when there's dialogue. Dialogue between all parties. And so, yes, sometimes you feel democracy hinders you doesn't let you take strong decisions. But sometimes that's for the good, because strong decisions can be wrong decisions. And sometimes strong decisions, but with the tempering of the views of others, can actually make them palatable and therefore effective decisions. I think in the last few years, we've seen a number of decisions, demonetization, for example, which were taken without, now with demonetization, you couldn't have wide consultation, but nevertheless, it turned out, in my view, to be a wrong decision. There are other decisions which have been taken hurriedly without widespread consultation. The farm bills which were withdrawn are an example. So in a democracy, it works when you have a dialogue. Now, it need not be an endless dialogue. You can have a dialogue, give people a sense of participation, let them modify certain elements, and often you find they know what the ground realities are better than a small coterie sitting in the Prime Minister's office. And therefore, they can actually ameliorate those decisions, and those decisions have greater staying power. I really think that when we bypass the process of consultation, we think we are taking bold decisions. Often we are taking decisions which won't have the kind of impact that the country needs.
I'm sure you didn't expect this, and you're not a politician, but it was interesting that the government did look at your remarks over the last few days and chose to talk about them in Parliament to make their case for why India is doing better economically versus the rest of the world. The BJP even said that, look, if our own critics are praising us, then we must be doing something right. What did you make of that, if anything?
You know, it was interesting. The word critic. I think what I try and do is offer as balanced a view. The problem is that, you know, balance often requires also criticism. There is a view from this government that only those who constantly clap are in the right because the government does no wrong. I mean, every government does wrong. I have criticized the UPA government when I was not part of that, the establishment, and I worked with the previous NDA government. I have no sort of reason to be excessively critical, but at the same time, some criticism is warranted. So don't label people who offer some criticism critics and therefore dismiss them, except when occasionally they say, you know, we're not in the situation of Sri Lanka as far as the economic situation goes. I mean, that's something which is very obvious, and certainly we don't want to scare off foreign investors by saying we have some big problem coming. We're not in that situation right now. Does that mean everything is right and everything is fine and therefore we should all be clapping? Absolutely not. We talked about some of the problems earlier. Let's be aware of the problems we have and be constructive, both outside and inside government, on how we will tackle them. That's the only way we will move forward as a nation.
But there is a lot of speculation about whether you would make a transition to politics. You were at a Congress event a few days ago. Is there any plan to actually join politics?
No, I actually work with the DMK government in Tamil Nadu. I'm on a council where we talk with the Tamil Nadu government. So I am an economist. I help whoever asks for my help if I can give it. And my real aim, as far as possible, is to make sure that we progress as a country. So no, I have no. I was invited by Mr. Shashi Tharoor. He said, I should take a look at what's going on in Chhattisgarh. I went there. I looked at some of the development. Was quite impressed by what was going on. And that was the payback for actually showing up at that conference.
Finally, Mr. Rajan, just coming back to the world economy, we started this program with the numbers of how things are really not good in so many leading economies. We have a conflict, Russia, Ukraine, and now, we have tensions today between the US and China over Taiwan. What is the impact that this may have then on all of us economically in the near future?
Well, we are in difficult times. Certainly, there is high inflation, which the Fed is trying to curb with higher interest rates, similarly with the RBI in India. I think that growth, even after they curb inflation, is a big question mark, again, around the world, both in the United States and in India. How do we get strong, sustainable growth? What are the things we need to do? And I think what this needs is really very strong imagination, leadership, and reforms. I think they're possible. So in the last few days in the US, we've seen some movement towards green investment, for example. That green investment could be a very important step forward. In India, I think if we can find ways to use the G20 mechanism to open up the world to our services, I think that would be a very important positive step, because we have a lot to offer in services. That's a place we've made a lot of positive movement, of course, in the past. So I would argue that we need to do something there. And so my sense is, when you're in difficult times, you find that there is a lot of possibilities. You can actually generate new sources of growth. We need to look for that. We need to persuade people that those are ways worth going on, and that's where the democratic process can help. So on the one hand, downsides. On the other hand, I think that's the time you look for potential upsides, and I'm sure we will find there's so many challenges we need to deal with. We will find some solutions.
Very quick last question. It just came to me as you were speaking about this. We've seen the Chinese economy. It's slowing down, and one of the biggest criticisms of the Chinese government has been its obsession with the zero COVID policy and these constant returns to lockdowns, which have really hurt manufacturing and supply chains around the world. Is there not an opportunity for India here?
There is.
And why aren't we able to hone that in the sense that why are we seeing manufacturers going to Vietnam and not coming here?
Well, we're seeing some come to India. People are coming. Let's not dismiss that. But you're right that we should be getting far more of them coming here. And it goes back to some of our deficiencies, right? Our manpower. We need a more skilled labor base. Our infrastructure, we still need to work on it. Logistics. I mean, these are all things certainly the government has been working on, but we need to do far more on it. And my sense is if we create that environment, if we create a welcoming environment, not sort of push back on big foreign investors and say, we really don't need you, but treat them with kindness, welcome them in, and give them a stable environment. I think far more people will come into India. So I think a lot can be done here. I think we can create a lot of jobs from this movement away from China. It's not so much movement away from China as diversification. People want a second source, a third source.
Exactly.
And it shouldn't be just Vietnam. It should be India also. I think we can do that, but we need to find the right mix of policies, but also we need to be really welcoming.
Raghuram Rajan, always a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very much for joining us on NDTV tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.